Chapter 1 A Very Nice Prince. There was nothing quite like the bustling streets of the royal city at dawn. The spring sun scoured the frost from the cobblestones, leaving a swirling haze in the wake of passers-by. A warm breeze perfumed with the heady scent of freshly baked bread, smeared with butter, rippled through the colorful flags decorating the palace's towers, and the musical greetings of a dozen different languages slowly overtook the songbirds lingering in the ramparts. Rain or shine, the streets were always alive, a potent reminder of everyone who depended on Prince August to maintain the peace and prosperity of his father's reign. There was nothing he wouldn't do for Charmant. Lord Robet's daughter has given him a grandchild. How wonderful, said his father, staring at August over the top of the letter. Imagine that, a grandchild. August's love of Charmant was the only thing keeping him from leaping from the window of his father's study and vanishing into the crowd. You have always had a lively imagination, father, August said. I'll send his daughter our congratulations then. His father harumphed and tossed the letter aside. Imagination doesn't keep me company. That's what friends are for, isn't it, Martin? Asked August. Martin, his best friend and partner for all court-related investigations, didn't look up from the timetable he was making for their upcoming day and muttered, Of course, Your Highness. It was difficult to be the human personification of a cloudy day in a room filled with promising sunlight, but Martin Tremblay managed it. He had mastered it while they were working opposite each other at school. Martin had thought August too carefree and impossible to take seriously, and August had considered the dreary older boy too sad for someone with so much. As sardonic as he was tall, Martin didn't believe in silver linings. He tempered August's more idealistic tendencies. See, father, you need a Martin, August said, and he gestured to the small pile of letters spread out across their table. Are there any letters of actual import? August and his father always met like this on the first morning of the week, in a small room awash in peachy early light. From a little after sunrise till sunset, the nobility gathered and citizens brought their concerns directly to the court. August called their little meetings meat fasts, since he had to eat whatever he could find while working if he didn't want his growling stomach to interrupt the proceedings, and father steadfastly ignored the name. The Grand Duke would join them once it was time. I have one here from General Dubois. Father shook a thin, already unfolded letter. His daughter is remarkably pretty, you know. Quite accomplished, too. August pried the raisins from his pastry and ate them one by one. Is that relevant to the letter? Father didn't answer outright, and that was answer enough. Father, August said softly, I will get married. I'm looking forward to finding someone I want to marry. But please stop interfering. Let me meet someone. It's not as though I'm taking over for you anytime soon. Children shouldn't be born to keep people company. He wished his father would give him this time and space he needed. Marriage didn't conjure images of roses or sunrises or whatever romantic things people talk about. It made him remember his father's utter destruction in the wake of his mother's death. At the same time, he wanted so badly that it hurt to love and be loved and not feel the sinking dread that washed over him when he thought of marriage. He didn't want to be afraid, but he didn't know how to stop. The contradiction made meeting someone all the more daunting. Father scowled. Don't give me that look. If you're going to meet someone, meet someone. August swallowed his response. His mother had always said it cost nothing to be nice, and successful ruling required frugality. You will have to consider marriage one day, August. I consider it every time you ask, said August, popping another raisin in his mouth. But I have yet to meet someone I feel strongly enough about to court. It seems that every eligible maiden falls short of your standards, said father with a huff. August scoffed. I've hardly met every eligible maiden. he hadn't met anyone he got along with well, it didn't matter. He had no misconceptions about their relationship, or lack thereof, and he specifically didn't think of her when meeting new people. No, I don't suppose you have, muttered Father. 20 million subjects. 23 million, corrected August without thinking. If Father didn't want to be corrected, then he shouldn't have given August such a thorough education. And you can't find a single one to marry. It's absurd. The reason he hadn't married was simple. He hadn't found anyone he trusted with Charmant. Whomever he married would have a say in the future of the kingdom. And if something happened to him, they might have the only say. It was all tangled up in what his mother had asked of him when she had gifted him her glass bracelet all those years ago, and he couldn't mention it to Father, because the man still went quiet whenever the late Queen was mentioned. The bracelet had been a lesson in responsibility, something for him to take care of and give to his future spouse years later. August might have left the bracelet at the cemetery with her, but he hadn't forgotten her words. This was given to me as a reminder of the wish I made. Magic, like our roles as royalty, is powerful, and we alone are responsible for how we use that power. And one day, it would be his responsibility to look after the kingdom, though that sentiment had been far less understandable for a 7-year-old. Her implications were clear now. If only he remembered more of his childhood with her, then he might know how to go about finding a partner. Father, August said, leaning across the table and taking the older man's face in his hands, are there any important letters we need to discuss before court? Father scrunched up his face. Fine, be that way. But one of these days, August, you're going to be old and gray and wondering where the time went, and wishing you had listened to your old man. On the contrary, I do listen to everything you say. August let his face go and sat back in his chair, eating the last few bites of his pastry. Whether or not it stays in my mind is an entirely different matter. His father sighed. Let's see. I had something here I knew you would want to look at. He shuffled through the correspondence address to the court and pulled free a thick fold of papers covered in cross writing. He had already broken the white wax seal featuring an ash tree. It's from Fresnay. Shock gripped August's lungs and ripped his breath away. He had been waiting for a letter from Fresnay for years. He had never been able to smother the hope still smoldering within him, and the part of him in which that hope had smoked and sputtered raged back to life. From Fresnay? August asked, trying to sound nonchalant. Martin, who usually ignored them entirely in favor of his own work, glanced up at that and set his papers and pen aside. August refused to glance his way. Father eyed him. From the mayor of Fresnay. Well then, that was completely different, and there was no reason for him to tie himself in knots over it. August's roiling stomach didn't settle, though. What does the letter say? August asked. Even if he didn't want to think about her, there were plenty of people he remembered and cared for from his childhood. Summers in Fresnay. It was a town within his kingdom. He had a responsibility to it. I skimmed over the contents when it arrived, Father said, flattening out the first piece of paper. There's something odd afoot, that's for certain. I had thought it was sent in jest at first, but the urgency and details are far too real. Mayor Blanche Faulkner insisted that people in Fresnay are losing their memories. Losing their memories? August asked, pushing everything aside and leaning across the table to study the letter. A sick, burning dread bubbled up in the back of his throat. How many? 5, when this letter was written, said Father. According to Faulkner, it started, so far as they could tell, a few years ago with one person. She's written a timeline in here somewhere, she says. 2 people have lost their memories this year, though, and people are worried that whatever is happening is occurring more frequently. I'll go, said August, bracing for Father's refusal. Absolutely not. Father threw up his hands. You've been gone all year. Assisting the royal court on behalf of the crown, said August, and he couldn't help laughing. What parent didn't like that their child was responsible? August liked his work, accounting for the kingdom, hearing out those who visited court, and serving the realm in whatever way was needed. August and Martin had spent most of the year investigating a rather tricky case of tax fraud and trying to find enough evidence to change some of the older and out-of-date inheritance laws. He knew he was lucky to have been born into his position during a time of relative peace and prosperity, and he intended to keep Charmant safe and sound. Fresnay was my home for half of the year growing up. Mother is in Fresnay. If they need help, I shall be the one to offer it. Father flinched at the mention of Mother, and August knew he had won. Perhaps it was underhanded, but he couldn't bear it if someone else were sent in his place. Forgive me, said Martin, frowning, but wouldn't a physician be a more appropriate choice to send? Something in the food or water, perhaps? August wondered aloud. Smart boy, said Father, ignoring August's contribution and wagging his finger at Martin. They had multiple physicians visit, and none was able to help. Something magical in origin, perhaps? Martin asked. August nodded, and his father cut him off. Tremblay, you can handle this by yourself, can't you? Father asked. You and August have been solving problems like this for years. Surely you could do it alone. Thank you, Your Majesty, said Martin slowly. He looked at August, who frantically shook his head. I'm afraid that I would be insufficient. August knows Fresnay and several of the people there, and he is more familiar with magic than I am. That last part wasn't true at all, but August appreciated the lie. Martin had been in all the same classes with him at university, including the ones on how to identify magic. Their jobs demanded the ability to spot magic. Humans stealing wands or coming up with absurd schemes to try to steal magic happened far too often. They made up perhaps a third of the jobs he and Martin took. One day, to do the initial questioning, and then you return and Tremblay takes over, said Father. Let him handle the investigation. August let out a short laugh. A day? 2 weeks. It's summer. There's little for me to do at court, and I'll be within a day's travel in case I need to return. No, his father said, impersonating his tone. 3 days. 1 week, said August. You'll have me the rest of the summer, and I want to do this right. I shall do an initial investigation, and then I shall return and report back to court with a plan for how to move forward. 5 days and not an hour more. You'll take Tremblay with you. Keep an eye on him and make sure he doesn't try to stay, Tremblay. Report back in 5 days, and then get a proper homecoming. Make your rounds at all the suppers. Make your calls to friends and play nice. Make yourself presentable for the season. The unsaid so that you can meet a nice person to marry hung between them. August wrinkled his nose. He didn't want to leave Fresnay in unfamiliar hands, though he had to keep his identity as the Crown Prince a secret, just as he had when he was a child. He could still help them. Then there was Ella. Of course, I'll take Martin, and it will be 5 days, said August, holding out his hand. But this is a serious matter, and it needs serious attention. If something happens, or I think I need to return, I shall, because that is my duty. You're a good boy, Father muttered, and shook his hand. Infuriating, but good. August smiled. Would I be less infuriating if I were bad? I would be happy to oblige. Hush, Father turned over the first page of the letter. Don't get your hopes up. This is odd. The sort of thing that people will say was a story, and not real years from now. The malady happened without apparent warning or reason and affected only specific memories. Memory loss wasn't unheard of. Injuries and illness caused it, often enough, but those were usually traceable. Martin had forgotten 3 years once after falling from a horse. The memories had come back slowly. The lack of apparent cause was more reason to suspect magic. What does specific memories mean? August asked. Father turned the paper sideways. A person, apparently. The first to lose his memory completely forgot one of his co-workers, and the second, his wife. Here, there's a list. He handed August one of the pages, and August hesitated. Slowly he skimmed the names of those who had forgotten, and relaxed. Ella wasn't listed. He didn't recognize all the names, but two stood out. Monette was the family name of the carpenter's apprentice he had met once as a boy, and Monsieur Allard was a cobbler who had always been nice to August regardless of how hard he was on his shoes. Blaise Julien sounded familiar, but he couldn't quite recall meeting them. They're only forgetting a single other person, he asked. Sounds like, Father mumbled. At first glance, August could find no similarities among the 5 people who had lost their memories or among those who had been forgotten. At second glance, he was still stumped. Martin unfolded his sinewy body from his chair and pushed aside the curtain of black hair that fell in front of his face. Let me see. Here, August said, and handed him the first part of the letter. About 5 years ago, a footman lost his memories of a lady's maid he had worked with. He forgot her completely, as though they had never met and he had never heard of her. Then a little over a year later, the local cobbler, that's Monsieur Allard, woke up with no memory of his wife. They've been married for ages, since long before I met them. An older woman forgot her neighbor completely 8 months later. 5 months after that, a retired guard. That's where I know the name from. Blaise used to work here in the city. Forgot one of their oldest friends. The latest person to lose their memories is a musician. Her son reported that she had forgotten his father. Father sighed and said, Terrible thing, forgetting a spouse. Terrible, Your Majesty, agreed Martin, frowning. How long after the previous instance was that? August handed Martin the papers. 4 months, give or take some days. It's accelerating, said Martin. So far, the only people who have lost their memories have been people who live in Fresno. Not all of them were born there, but perhaps you have to be there a while for the memory loss to happen, said August as Martin read. There's not enough data to form a real guess. Fresno is a small town surrounded by several estates, so there are people moving through it constantly. Martin held up one of the pages. The mayor says they asked around for anyone passing through who's experienced the same thing, but they found no cases. That's promising. Father cleared his throat. And why I'm letting you go, August. There was an awful lot of information, but very little of it seemed useful. That was the issue with most mysteries. There was so much information that whoever was looking at it couldn't discern the relevant evidence from the chaff. This will be difficult, even for us, said Martin. Don't discount us before we even start, said August. We have better resources than anyone else. You're also not alone, Father said. I shall write to your mother's fairy godmother to ask if she can help. No one is a better expert on magic than a fairy. And for all their isolation, they usually return my letters. His mother's fairy godmother was something of an ambassador to Charmant. Fairies had an amicable relationship with nearly every kingdom, offering advice on magic since it was rare and almost always theirs. They seldom interfered with human politics and appeared only when a person had lost all hope. They delighted in restoring it with a wish. If this was magic, she would know for sure. Martin folded the letter back up and muttered, We can leave first thing tomorrow morning. Someone knocked on the door, and August heard the Grand Duke's familiar footsteps coming down the hall. It was time for court. Father snapped his fingers and stood, poking Martin in the chest with his finger. Very well, but if you don't have him back here, I'm rolling you in honey and leaving you for the bears. His father left without so much as another backward glance, and August eased into his chair. Martin was as tense as a tightly coiled spring next to him, face set with fear. The more outrageous the threat, the more likely he is not to remember he asked you to do anything at all, said August, rolling his eyes. He's only upset because he knows I'm right and that I should be the one to go. I recognize some of the names in this letter. I won't abandon them. Looking after the kingdom is my job. Martin hummed. And you're sure your resoluteness has nothing to do with the girl you used to write with when we were at school? Those letters you got were from Fresno. No, she's not mentioned in any of this, said August. She might have moved away for all I know. Her utter lack of context still smarted despite the years, and August couldn't stand Martin's pitying silence. Think about it like this, said August, and he gathered up all the papers. Regardless of my ulterior motives, this is something that needs to be done, and it needs to be done with kindness. These are memories. They're personal. Whoever goes to help must be gentle. We'll do right by them. I understand, said Martin. I know, and I trust you more than anyone, which is part of why I want you with me, said August. Martin might have seemed like a pessimist of the highest order, but he truly cared about anyone and everyone. Every moment he wasn't working for the court, he was back in his family holdings, taking care of the people and land. August clapped and let out a deep breath. Now, we can do this. We can figure this out. Must you be so hopeful? Martin asked. If people see a noble frowning, they worry, whether there is cause or not. Members of the court showing up and looking defeated will make them think there's no solution. I don't want to contribute to the fear. I'm sure they're experiencing enough already. August slapped him on the back. Regardless, it's a week in the countryside. But August was sure if he thought too long about Fresno, of his childhood friend who had left a hole in his heart, and the prospect of seeing her, he might not smile ever again.